Hey everyone, I'm Casey Palmer from Casey Palmer Canadian Dad, one of Canada's premier brands on parenting and fatherhood. Creating a dad brand has brought some interesting things into my life over the years, but recently Netflix gave me the opportunity to sit down in a small group of parenting influencers and be in a roundtable conversation with Ryan Reynolds in advance of his new movie, The Adam Project, coming out on Netflix this Friday, March the 11th. It was awesome to even be considered for something like this, and I wanted to make the most of it, reaching out to my community to find out what kind of questions I should ask Ryan in the limited time we'd have available. But it turned out we'd only have time for one, so I had to make it count. And while I think I came up with the perfect question, Ryan had an even better answer. Check it out. Hello, I'm Casey Palmer from Casey Palmer Canadian Dad, and my handle is at Casey Palmer because keep consistent, I guess.
Right, yes,
right?
exactly,
yeah?
right.
Easy to find me.
Lean into it. Yeah.
So as a dad, I have two boys. They're 8 and 6, and I know you have your girls, and it's such an interesting space to be in because fatherhood has, only recently people are started really diving into like what makes a dad what they are, right? We're not these stoic, one-dimensional characters in the background who just get a drink after work. Like we're in there doing things and everything. And what I think I really appreciate about the Adam Project is that it brought humanity to the father character, where it's just like not just like this guy or this guy who just gives you sage advice or stuff. He's as flawed as everybody else. Yeah. And I thought that was really cool. And so I was wondering, you're on here as a producer, and I was wondering what elements of fatherhood really drew you to it when you were reading the script, when you're going into putting this together, when you're doing your performance as this character who gets to see it not only from the child perspective, but the child as an adult at the same age as his dad, because time travel perspective. Yeah. Like, where does it resonate with you on that, and why is it so important to you?
Well, that's the wish fulfillment part, right? Yeah. Like that's the part that then the wish fulfillment is, and certainly in the construction of these movies is often through the gaze of the kid, the child protagonist, but it's also in this case through Big Adam as well. And his wish, I think he's not expressing it, but his underlying inner child is screaming, "Please fix this with Dad." And I think that I know in my life, and this is something that was very important to me in the storytelling, is that I have told myself stories about my father that weren't true. For years it was that he was this and this and this, and it's sort of like I liken it to a nickname. If you give someone a nickname, typically it's like a really vicious form of bullying. Sometimes it's endearing, but other times it's like you're isolating one aspect of their physicality that you're using as a nickname, and that typically erases all the other nuance, right? So like the stories I was telling about my father, I sort of thought of later in life as a nickname. And I did have a nickname for him. I had Jimbo was the nickname. His name is Jim. My brothers and I called him Jimbo. And we talked about Jimbo. Jimbo was always somebody who was like, a skin-covered landmine. A guy who had a short fuse, who was like this very, very one-dimensional kind of character, not unlike what you described as the guy who comes home after work, fixes himself a scotch, sits down, and doesn't speak. And in certain ways that was my dad, but in other ways it wasn't. He was also there. He was always there. He was a guy like taking us camping in British Columbia, and he was like, a guy who's never missed a baseball game that I had, never, there were all these other things that I chose to sort of leave out because it didn't fit the Jimbo narrative that I had of him. So like, as I got older, I was like, oh wow, like, my dad died years ago, and I realized I got more and more angry at him after his death, and it was because it was reaffirming this lazy story that I kept telling myself about him, and also, and it's in the movie, is that there's a point in this movie where the kid says, and this was like a last minute rewrite I did while I was in quarantine for the movie, but I was like, I figured out why I hated my dad. I hated him because he died, and it was such a weird reason that I felt shame about. Like, you can't hate someone because they died. Like, that is a shame. Like, I felt real shame about that, and so I naturally put it in the movie, and I had the kid say it to my character that you hate him because he died, and I really did with my own father, because I didn't have that shot at any kind of reconciliation or understanding of who he was, but again, like, he was just a man, just doing the best he could, and he was programmed by his parents. Much like my kids are, to a certain degree, I know that's an ugly way of expressing it, but they're sort of programmed by my sensibility and my wife's sensibility. It's our kind of, we're trying to infuse them with empathy, and we're trying to infuse them with like whatever skills they're going to need to at least make the world a little bit better when they leave it, and it's a lot of that. And my father was, really subject to that kind of parenting from his dad. I know my grandfather was the guy who came home. He mowed the lawn after he would roll up one of his sleeves on each side, and then he would loosen just the top button and undo just the tie just a little bit, and then go mow the lawn. Like, dude, I go out there in a muumuu, and let's go. Like, I'm gonna do this with comfort.
Get it done. Yeah,
not necessarily style, but comfort. So. Yeah, it's interesting. Like the parent, it's sort of, and that's another thing that's in the movie too. Is every bully has a bully, right? Like it's, every parent that doesn't exactly hit the bullseye, probably had a parent who didn't hit the bullseye for a variety of reasons that weren't necessarily willful,
Now, while I couldn't make it out to the Toronto premiere of The Adam Project later that day, I did see the photos, and it looks like it was a really fun time, with plenty of interactive exhibits, kids loving life as they start to get out of the home again, and of course, appearances from Mr. Reynolds himself as people flock to the red carpet to get all the selfies. Shout out again to Netflix for the opportunity, and here's hoping this is the first of many. This is Casey Palmer, signing off.